it. So
Okay.
yeah, I don't think we'll show up last minute.
Yeah.
Live stream on.
That's good though, that's good.
That's what I was trying to say earlier. You know, we put all this effort into the in-person.
Just getting
It's just no good.
No.
I think that for me, I just feel calm. Yeah, I just feel, you know, it's just too difficult.
And I think as sort of it's cozier in the evening, get the fire on and the cat on your lap, you're not getting anywhere, right?
No. Even though you want to.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
They're going to put the camera lights on, so we might get a bit more. Right. I mean, are you showing something on the screen?
No, I've just got my own notes, don't worry. Thank you.
Can we ask people to please come closer to us so we feel more comfortable? No problem, you can bring your food along with you. Tell us when you're ready. Okay. This is 2 minutes. I have to share the mics. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Abdullah Faliq. I will be your host this evening. Welcome to this evening's event, discussion and report launch on mainstreaming hate, how the right exploits the crisis to divide us. It's a new report, a recent report by the Institute of Race Relations. The authors are here, Liz and Sophia. They'll talk more about the report a bit later on. But very quickly about myself, I'm the president of the European Network on Religion and Belief. I'm a trustee at this mosque here also, which is one of the oldest and the largest mosques in Western Europe. I'm also the managing director of the Cordoba Foundation. This evening's event is really to learn a bit more about the report itself, where our two esteemed guests will speak about the report, give us some of the highlights, but also to share our experiences across the country in light of the recent far-right violence and the threats, and how we can continue the conversation afterwards. So before I go into introducing the speakers, I'll just make some quick announcements. This event is being filmed and photographed, so please be aware. It's been streamed on the YouTube of the Cordoba Foundation YouTube channel, and it's probably linked to some of the other partner organizations. Secondly, the toilets are on either side of the corridor outside. Any issues, just talk to one of the volunteers outside. If you could please switch off your mobile phones or put it on silent so it doesn't disturb the proceedings. There is no planned fire alert, or fireworks, fire alert. So if there is one, please look for the signs and make a speedy exit. And to let you know, because we're starting a few minutes late, we also have the Maghrib prayers, the evening prayers at around 7:30. So we'll break for about 15-20 minutes, and we'll continue after 8 o'clock for another 15 minutes. So if that's okay with you, please stay back for the discussion part. So this event is jointly organized by the Civil Society Consulting, the main organizers, in partnership with the European Network on Religion and Belief, INOB, and the Institute of Race Relations, the authors of the report, 32 Steps program, which my colleague here, Mark, will talk a bit more about later on, and the Cordoba Foundation. So it's a joint endeavor. Although the numbers are quite small here, but we are being joined by quite a number of people online on YouTube, and this recording will be available afterwards also. The format of the meeting is very simple. So after myself, Mark will make a few welcoming remarks. Then we'll have Liz and Sophia talk about the report, followed by Dr. Amina Isat, who will talk about Islamophobia across Europe, and this will be followed by Dr. Emmanuel Achiri, who will talk about the extremists, far right in Europe. And then we'll have discussion. The discussion part will be in 2 parts. So we'll start off before prayers, and after prayers we'll continue it. So that's the very briefly the aims and the format of the program this evening. So if I can ask now Mark to say a few words as a starting. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Abdullah, for that welcome and for that context as well. I mean, I think that certainly in civil society consulting, and I've also been part-time director at the European Network on Religion and Belief, the rise of the far right across Europe, but clearly in this country as well, is something that really concerns us greatly. And when we saw the report at Civil Society, we saw the report from the IRR, we thought, you know, we need to discuss this report. It needs to be part of a wider dialogue as part of our 32 Steps to Togetherness project. And I think we were looking to do this event tonight, thinking it was going to be before the election, if you might recall. Clearly it's been after the election, but it's been after the horrendous racist riots that we saw just a month ago, which a lot of the report prefigures, really. I mean, on a positive note, from our perspective, is that we are leading on a project called 32 Steps to Togetherness. We've got some of the catchphrases here. We put the information in front of you today as a progress report, but also a summary of what these steps are and what we think individuals, organisations, communities can do. And we've been working on that project now for a year with a lot of different partners that are in this room, actually. With ENAR, European Network Against Racism, where we were party to some work with them just over a year ago, and we've really rolled out some really quite exciting initiatives across England in a kind of hotspot approach, and this work is trying to bring civil society, faith-inspired leaders together to see what we can do to address the divisions that we see in front of us. And I just wanted to add to that, because it will be something I'm sure we'll be discussing today, because a lot of our work has been underpinned by the huge growth in loneliness that we see in our society and the isolation that some communities then experience in response to that. So a lot of our work around the Togetherness programme is focused on that. So we've got a quick little film, I think, Francesca, if we're lucky, with the technology, just to talk about the steps. This is when the technology is hopefully everybody can see that.
32 Steps to Togetherness.
Oh.
Maybe we can come back to you later on. Okay.
Okay.
No problem. Yeah.
Is the internet not quite strong enough for it? I don't think.
I think it's gone off. I'll just see if we can connect.
Okay. But we're very keen to involve new organisations and new partners in that work that we're doing on an ongoing basis. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
Will I just try now?
Okay, let's try once more.
32 Steps to Togetherness is a manual of 32 actions.
No problem. Thanks, Mark, again. So we'll move on speedily. And in the interest of saving time, I'm not going to read out all the bios because you've got a copy of that as you registered. So the main part of this event is really our dear speakers, Liz Faket and Sophia Siddiqui, the two authors of the reports. So I'll let them quickly go over the report. And because Dr. Amir needs to leave early, we'll bring her on afterwards and take a few questions. So we'll see how that goes for a start. So over to you, Liz and Sophia.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak about the report, which was actually written before the far-right orchestrated racist riots, which we insist on calling them. But the report obviously focuses on the mainstreaming of hate by politicians and the press, but I don't need to tell you that there is always a context for what has been happening over the last few years. This is one thing that our society with the 24-hour news always refuses to let us discuss, is context, as though bad things happen in a vacuum. And the context for our report is the Islamophobia and anti-refugee, anti-migrant racism that has become deeply embedded in British society. And this has been going on since a long, long time, but in the modern period, since at least 1990s, anti-Muslim racism has grown in lockstep with anti-terrorist laws and the attack on civil rights that accompanied the war on terror. At the same time, hostility towards foreigners, what we at the Institute call xenoracism, has increased in line with government laws that treat migration as a crime, not a human right. Extreme right media frameworks, but constantly link vulnerable minorities to backward values and invasion, have embedded racism and Islamophobia in the public consciousness. So the purpose of our report is not to restate that history, but to show the state of play today. And what has come to pass is a veritable racist and Islamophobic free-for-all, the mainstreaming of hate in electoral politics. Racism is now more than ever a weapon wielded by ambitious politicians. Some might even call their scattergun tactics political thuggery. Asylum seekers and Muslims emerge as collateral damage of the electoral racism of politicians, whether Reform UK, Conservative or Labour. So the report was published before the general election, actually. It was published in April 2024, but as the Chair has already said, it anticipated the results as well as the riots. In particular, the last section of our report, which looks at how far-right groups like Patriotic Alternative attempt to embed themselves in local community campaigns around the housing of asylum seekers or violence against women and girls. This was so much the basis for what happened recently. The violence that we saw taking place a few weeks ago hasn't stopped. The situation in Northern Ireland is still critical. Mosques, ethnic minorities, businesses continue to be attacked and arsoned. But our report shows us that the riots were actually driven by local people, albeit plugged into far-right propaganda networks, and that's important. Although it was orchestrated by the far right, most of it was carried out by local people influenced by far-right ideas. By the way, I think we should stop talking about far-right disinformation and name it for what it is: fascist lies and propaganda. The report rightly warns that the far right are preparing for race war, but it also points out that its messages have gained traction in line with the hard right emerging as a significant electoral political force. The report was written before the general election, as I say, and before the emergence of Nigel Farage's Reform UK party as the third largest party in Parliament. And let's not forget, they came second in 103 constituencies and gained 4 million votes. The hard right is a category that may not be familiar to you. We find it a useful way of showing a spectrum of opinion that travels from far-right electoral parties like Reform to mainstream political influencers like Suella Braverman, Michael Gove, Kemi Badenoch, the former Labour MP and so-called political violence czar John Woodcock, as well as neoconservative and identitarian international alliances and think tanks that recklessly promote culture wars. There's a section in the report on the foxification of British news, thanks to GB News and Talk TV, and a breakdown about how right frameworks break into the mainstream via slogans like British jobs for British workers, All Lives Matters, and Stop the Boats. And now, after the riots, sadly we can see more slogans entering the lexicon. We can add enough is enough, which was the far-right propaganda message that circulated on social media and fueled the riots, but also the Labour slogan, Smash the Gangs. Smash the Gangs policy of this government is thoroughly toxic. It equates smugglers with terrorists. It equates channel crossers with organised criminal networks. And both smugglers and asylum seekers who arrive by boat are now associated in racist culture with Muslims. It's as though all the racist demons promoted by the war on terror and the war on refugees have been put into a witch's cauldron and stirred up into one new potent stereotype. Before I hand over to Sophia, who's going to talk about the weaponisation of violence against women and girls, I just want to draw attention to the subtitle of the report, How the Far Right Exploits the Crisis to Divide Us. We can't divorce the fight against racism from a fight for social and economic justice, from the fight against the things that Mark has described, against loneliness, against poverty, against immiserisation. We're living through a profound social crisis due to decades of spending tax. There's no sign that this is going to stop, and we don't need a government that plays one group against another. But it's the dismantling of a welfare state, the devastation caused by the cuts to the fabric of our communities that are constantly pushing the buttons, emotional big buttons between them and us. And it is the politics of scarcity that we need to combat.
Hello. So thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to continue where Liz left off. I'm going to discuss a bit more in detail what actually triggered the recent outbreak in Islamophobic and racist violence, which has kind of been forgotten about, particularly by the mainstream news, which was the killing of 3 young girls at dance class in Southport. And what followed was an online conspiracy frenzy that circulated a false claim that the killer was a Muslim man who had arrived in the UK on a small boat. This weaponized the killings of 3 young girls for a racist agenda. And this is absolutely key to highlight because this trope that Muslim men pose a threat to white women and girls is a key driver of far-right and Islamophobic violence that must be urgently combated across society because it is absolutely central to how Islamophobia and anti-migrant racism operates. And as we outline thoroughly in our report, the roots of this narrative goes back to discussions around so-called British Pakistani grooming gangs, an issue exploited by the EDL for over a decade, but also evoked by our politicians across the spectrum when it's convenient. And today we're particularly seeing this rhetoric fusing with moral panics around the so-called migrant invasion. The underlying logic is the same. This combines anti-migrant racism with Islamophobia and has fueled retaliatory attacks on asylum housing, mosques, businesses, homes, and communities as they go about their everyday life. Such moral panics are a key tool to gaining footholds in communities, and as Liz said, it was mainly local people who were driving these attacks. Because ultimately, these moral panics, they feed off anxieties around crime, around economic insecurity, housing shortages, unemployment, and diminishing healthcare. It's an emotive narrative that's been successful in mobilizing people by ultimately creating fear and scapegoating refugees and Muslims and playing into racist tropes. And most disturbingly, it raises a key issue, which is the threat of violent misogyny. Instead, the killing of 3 girls was hijacked by the far right, who claimed to be acting as protectors of women and children, which ultimately shifted the conversation away from urgent questions around incel culture and Andrew Tate-style misogyny that radicalizes men and boys online, and instead collectively blames the Muslim and migrant community. And here it's important to highlight that it was Muslim women in particular who've been targeted in racist attacks and at the receiving end of rape and death threats, with a recent poll by the Muslim Women's Network finding that 75% of those surveyed were worried about their safety, with 1 in 5 experiencing hostility, and we know that that's a massive underreporting. And another far-right conspiracy theory that we highlight in our reports, which has come to dominate the international extreme right, is the Great Replacement theory. And this theory holds that white populations are being demographically and culturally replaced by non-white people, particularly from Muslim-majority countries. And this is a conspiracy theory that has been central to mass shooters' manifestations in recent years across the world, but it's also increasingly part of far-right discourse here, which we need to be really attuned to. This idea of replacement is a prevalent theme of anti-migrant and anti-Muslim racism that passes from the fringe to the centre of respectable discourse. And in recent months, we've heard MPs calling areas like this, Tower Hamlets, a no-go area, claiming that Islamists have got control over London, and appear in the House of Lords claiming that Birmingham and 9 other English local authorities will be majority Muslim by 2031. And such dangerous language normalises ideas around population replacement. And until we tackle this, far-right rhetoric and the demonisation of Muslims and migrants is going to keep becoming more and more normalised. So now I'm going to pass over to Liz, who will focus more on the government response.
How are we doing for time?
We're okay.
Yeah.
We're okay.
Because I'm going to talk a little bit about the government response, and then Sophie's going to read through some of our recommendations.
7 minutes or so.
Okay. So, a rhetorical question. What has the government learnt from the riots? It seems to me not a lot. I think the role of government is to educate against racism. But have we seen the Prime Minister on the steps of Downing Street issuing a strong message against Islamophobia and racism? Has he gone has been photographed outside a mosque? Great for GB News. They would love that. And that's probably why he hasn't been photographed outside the mosque. Has he gone to an asylum hotel? Have we seen any acknowledgement of the role the state and politicians play in the mainstream of hate? I think not. Instead, we hear talk from the government of violent thuggery on all sides of the ideological spectrum, even as we see a further ratcheting up of measures to criminalise Palestinian solidarity, as though to take to the streets against a genocide was the same thing as attacking mosques and asylum seekers. We're beginning to, when we at the Institute, we publish a bi-weekly news service called IRR News. If you're not signed up to it, I encourage you to do so. So we're monitoring what's happening in the court. And we're seeing that the government narrative of violent thuggery on all sides is actually leading to harsh sentences against Muslims who acted in community defence. I think we should be writing the sequel to Mainstreaming Hate. Mainstreaming Hate, Horror Movie Part 2. As we move forward, the Islamophobia Action Group have warned that the situation is critical and called on the government to accept the APPG definition of Islamophobia. I think it's just absolutely crazy after decades of Islamophobia that there is no definition, there is no understanding, there is no outcry in Parliament. It's astounding. Any intervention that forces the government to address Islamophobia is to be welcomed. But I also think we need to be multidimensional. We need to look at all strategies, including encouraging trade unions to do more work in deprived white working class communities, including community self-defence, in the recognition that different paths can lead to the same definition. We need to put pressure on the government to stop the Islamophobic messages emanating from its own party and policies, particularly in relation to solidarity with Palestine, and confront hard-right influencers in Parliament. And I think one of the recommendations from MEND is particularly important in this respect. They produced a report called A Race to the Bottom, Avoiding Further Curbs to Freedom of Speech under Labour. And I think their suggestion is that we concentrate on the government's weak spots, like its continued reliance on divisive figures like Jonathan Ashworth, the Labour MP who lost the Leicester South seat to the independent candidate Shelka Adam, and John Woodcock, Lord Warney, who continues as a government advisor on political violence and disruption, a post created by Boris Johnson, and apparently now sits on the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper's Defending Democracy Task Force. Woodcock's frameworks when it comes to the Muslim community, particularly the British Palestinian diaspora, do not seem that dissimilar to hard-right figures like Suella Braverman and Kemi Badenoch, who as part of her campaign to be leader of the Conservative Party described the newly elected independent MPs as conducting sectarian Islamic politics.
So now I'm just going to move on to our recommendations in the report that are particularly urgent in our current context. Firstly, we need to build unity that is multiracial, multi-faith, multi-gender in order to fight racism and fascism. Unity isn't something that just comes about naturally, but it's something we have to actively work towards by building strong links with social movements and communities, whilst resisting fragmentation within our own communities as well. And this also means forging connections with groups across the country, because particularly isolated communities outside of big cities with less diversity were more vulnerable to being targeted. Secondly, we need to fight back against the demonisation of refugees, asylum seekers and migrants, who are some of the most vulnerable people in society. Our struggles are deeply, deeply connected. An attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, and we must fight for the rights of all people and stand against nativism, which attempts to pit people together. Thirdly, we need to challenge and confront those who demonise and divide. This means challenging politicians across the spectrum and the media class who regularly perpetuate racist and anti-migrant rhetoric that emboldens the far right and ultimately gives racists permission to act. We also have to recognise that the far right riots occurred in 7 out of 10 of the most deprived areas in the country. This is a space in which a resurgent far right is building. In order to take on the far right, we have to address material concerns, the cost of living crisis, housing, employment. We need to be able to offer a vision of community that's meaningful and address the issues that people are facing. And finally, we need to do the slower work of building coalitions and developing a political vision which includes political education and cross-collaborations across groups in order to truly create the vision of a society that we all want to live in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz and Sophia, for the highlighting report and its main findings. I'm sure we'll have a discussion afterwards. Can I now turn to Dr. Amina Issa-Das? She's a senior lecturer in politics. She has to leave soon, so we'll ask her to make a presentation. We'll take maybe a couple of questions for her also. And she'll talk about Islamophobia across Europe. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much to the organisers. I feel quite honoured to be part of an esteemed panel and to be here talking with you all this evening. So in my presentation, I'm just going to be going over perhaps some complementary remarks to the points that Liz and Sophia have already made in discussing Islamophobia in Europe. So I really want to reflect on what Islamophobia is, the ways in which it manifests in Europe, the points of potential convergence and divergence that we see across the continent, and the ways in which it's mainstreamed across Europe and in the UK. So in doing so, I'm drawing on 2 significant pieces of work in which I've been involved, one of which was a European Commission-funded project where we looked at both the nature of Islamophobia, but also best practices in countering Islamophobia that are already being employed by key stakeholders in communities. And in that study, we looked at 8 case studies. So we looked at France, Germany, Belgium, the UK, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Portugal, and Greece. It's always a mouthful to try and remember those. Really, we had some, I guess, Western European, but also potentially cases that are seen more as on the fringes in the southern areas where austerity, etc., have perhaps been more keenly felt, although arguably looking at the UK now, I'm not sure we could make that same claim. We did this research up to sort of 2019 when we published a book on it. And I'm also drawing on a book, an edited volume that I've just published in May this year, where I look at gendered Islamophobia, and it's a collection with other scholars in the area. So in my work, I typically use the APPG definition that Liz mentioned, which describes Islamophobia as a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. I feel that this is increasingly adopted by many of us in the field and a number of kind of key actors as well, in that it helps us understand the ways in which Islamophobia transcends people, practice, and place. And it's not really about being Muslim, it's about being perceived as Muslim. In terms of the ways in which this functions, although this is taken from the UK context, it's very much applicable in the European context as well, I would argue. The ways in which we see Islamophobia manifesting across Europe, again, very similar to the UK. We have the interpersonal experiences, like the violence that we saw during the UK riots, evident in those hate crime statistics that are often the tip of the iceberg, but also factors such as denial of service. So we, in that study, came across women who were told, you can't get on the bus here, public transport, great Europe kind of nationalised systems that it has that we can only look at enviously in the UK. But, you know, a public service that they couldn't access because they wore hijab was completely unlawful, but it's very much normalised by some of these political narratives and press narratives that we're seeing, and really this sort of cyclical nature of the political policy legislative element and the way in which it feeds into the interpersonal acts of sort of violence, exclusion and denial of services. So it's very similar there. In our study, we looked at sort of the nature of Islamophobia and tried to really map what was going on across these 8 quite different contexts. And really we found that whilst there are contextual specificities, so for example in Greece there might be greater emphasis on Greco-Turkish history and Greco-Turkish relations, whereas in the Czech Republic, where there's almost an absence of a Muslim population, so no real encounters with Muslims or very limited encounters with Muslims, you see these points of similarity. And we would say that in this study we found that Islamophobia was characterized by this notion of Muslim threat. Demographic threat, the Great Replacement Theory that Sophia mentioned, and whether that's sort of through the perceived hyperfertility or hyperfecundity of Muslims, but also proselytization, that if Muslims are seen, they will automatically force other people to become Muslims, so therefore their presence must be a concealed and discreet presence. That Muslims pose an alleged cultural threat, this is ideological, that they have parallel practices in society, and that they wish to enforce these parallel practices on the wider white majority society. Muslims in our research were seen as inherently violent and barbaric, echoed in some of that gendered dimension element that Sophia mentioned, around kind of it's almost like Muslims can't help themselves, that they act in misogynist or culturally and physically violent ways, that they favour gender inequality, allegedly apparent in Muslim women's dress and it being allegedly forced upon them, and that they are inherently and kind of at their very root unassimilable, and they will forever be the problematic other. And this was something that we saw real convergence across the continent. So while you have the specificities, there's this coming together in this idea that Muslims are threatening, and therefore this threat must be dealt with. In terms of the mainstreaming of Islamophobia, we very much found this within context and between contexts. And the far right is absolutely central, but this mainstreaming is functioning on and relying on the banalization or the normalization of of Islamophobia across Europe and the UK. And in some of the work I discuss in the edited handbook on gendered Islamophobia, I start to draw on this idea of liberal Islamophobia, and that perhaps giving us some of the linguistic tools to start to explain the kind of various ways in which the Islamophobia is becoming normalized. And I use Mondon and Winter's work here. So the liberal Islamophobia trope draws very much on and comes together with, you'll see a meeting point with far-right Islamophobia, particularly along gendered lines, but it's seen as a common sense response. So as part of our liberal society and our protection of democracy, we must discipline Muslimness to ensure that our kind of liberal ways of doing and being in the West are protected. There's a quote from Mondon and Winter that I find quite helpful. They talk about a widespread and normalized criticism of the essentialized Muslim threat for its hatred of our liberal freedom and tolerant societies. They continue, the ways in which liberal Islamophobia is articulated is through, in one way, the evocation of gender rights in the West, particularly around banning the hijab and the burqa in the name of emancipation. So this is perhaps one of the tools that we could use along understanding the hard right and far right articulations of racism to try and perhaps broaden that lens and understand the way in which the left is also becoming increasingly central through these liberal articulations and it being a sort of almost common sense response. And one of the ways in which, in my own work, I explain this liberal common sense articulation of Islamophobic practice is through looking at the case study of France, where you have bans like in 2004, the ban through the Loi Stasi on headscarves in schools that has been replicated across Europe, Belgium being one of them, or the Loi Anti-Niqab, so the face veil ban implemented first in France in 2010, followed swiftly by Belgium in 2011, in Austria, and debates in Switzerland. It was almost like a domino effect. So this is potentially one of the ways. And the assumption there was that Muslim men are violent and that they are forcing Muslim women to cover this way. When in fact in France, when this ban was implemented, there were around an estimated 300 women that wore. For an enormous Muslim community like that, that's really quite insignificant. But perhaps it's about generating political narrative, generating press narrative to continue this myth of a Muslim essentialized threat. And in these sorts of bans in France, we see the evocation of women's rights, but also Orientalist tropes around Muslim male barbarity, Muslim women's submissiveness, to continue and legitimize or pseudo-legitimize. And we see this kind of recycling of historic colonial tropes to maintain and normalize the far right and the left wing, increasingly left wing. And also kind of looking at from the far right to the left, we see some of the paradoxes sort of through ideas like feminationalism, where you have the evocation of feminist tropes by other women to limit other women's, another group of women's freedoms. And this kind of paradoxical feminist evocation is not problematized in ways in which that we really ought to see it being done if we're thinking about genuine equality and sort of fairness across the board. How am I doing for time? I think conclude. Okay, I'll wrap up then with my concluding remarks. So, thinking about the 32 steps to togetherness and also the IIR report, I think Islamophobia in Europe is not dissimilar to what we're seeing in the UK, and therefore I'd say there are best practices. There is a globalizing far right, far left kind of spectrum of Islamophobia that requires, I think, further investigation, further analysis, and I think it's cross-political, and that's quite important to highlight. In addition to this far left, the road is long, and I think we'll kind of have to continue on our anti-racist fight. But thank you ever so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amina. Bang on time. That's good. Yeah. And our final speaker for the evening has travelled all the way from, is it Belgium or France?
Brussels, yeah, Belgium.
Brussels, okay. Just probably an hour ago, is Dr. Emmanuel Achiri. He's a policy advocacy advisor at the European Network Against Racism. And he'll talk about similar Islamophobia across Europe, but more looking at racism and the extremist element of that and the far right. So over to you, you've got about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think that, and thanks to all the speakers, we share, I think, similar ways of views of looking at, the current phenomena which we are witnessing. And not to repeat, I think, what the other speakers have said, I think that how we address this or try to address right-wing extremism or like Islamophobia and racism is by looking at it from a very structural approach. And our argument basically is that we talked today about right-wing extremism, Islamophobia, and so on and so forth, but the issue here is white supremacy. And that is the main issue which we need to tackle. And right-wing extremism, which is a term that we prefer not to use. We prefer to call it plain old racism and fascism. That is what it is. I think also by referring to it as right-wing extremism, we also allow for others to say, well, there is also left-wing extremism. But I mean, on the one hand, we have people who are arguing and calling for social justice, and on the other hand, we have people who are saying we want to kill some people, we want to kill and oppress other people. So we need to call it what it is. This is just another phase of fascism and racism, plain old fascism, just using different tools. And so when we look at white supremacy as we prefer to see it as part of a structure which goes beyond just color of the skin, but a structure which is founded on racialism, founded on capitalist, extractivist ideologies, and on patriarchy as well. So this is an entire structure which we are dealing with. And today what we are faced with in Europe, whether this is mainland Europe or the UK, is basically a moment of crisis. We often talk about migration crisis, quote unquote, and other crises. But what we are faced today is a crisis of European identity, a crisis of Europe. Because for a very long time, on the one hand, Europe pretends to want to address its history with colonialism, its history with enslavement, its history with, Islamophobia is an old phenomenon. In Europe, we are talking of 1,000-year phenomenon, so this is not a new thing. And on the other hand, Europe still does not want to address these issues. I mean, you just need to look around the UK or you look around Europe and you're still going to see statutes and names of streets and buildings named after enslavers, named after genocidaires, named after some of the worst people in history. We wouldn't say the same thing about figures like Hitler. It's unacceptable to name a street after Hitler, but we still have streets and places named after the likes of Churchill, after the likes of Leopold, after the likes of Napoleon Bonaparte. Those are people that, so you see that we have two different forces. On the one hand, you have this pretense that we are trying to do something about fascism and racism, and on the other hand, it is structurally embedded in all facets of European institutions and ways of life. And so what we have is a crisis of identity at this moment, and the right-wing extremism, or if I would rather say the fascism and the Islamophobia we are facing, is just another moment where this crisis reaches a moment of crescendo. And Europe needs vehicles to be able to justify this fascism and this racism. So liberal vehicles in order to be able to justify this. And I think as you mentioned earlier, one of them is liberal Islamophobia. So trying to present this as an issue of human rights, as an issue of democracy, as an issue of feminism. On the other hand, not on the other hand, but also one of these other vehicles is anti-migrant rhetoric, which is just simply racism. This is also another vehicle through which we are having the discourse on fascism and racism, because, well, we are talking about all of these irregular migrants, we are talking about the smugglers, the traffickers, those who are crossing the channels, or those who are crossing the Mediterranean Sea, or coming from Eastern Europe. So we have all of this anti-migrant racism and rhetoric, which is another vehicle. And of course, we also have fascist groups as well, borrowing the rhetoric of class struggle. You know, this is about resources. This is about people taking away our resources. This is about lack of social welfare and services. And at the same time, we cannot remove this current phase as well from the ongoing genocide in Gaza, because the ongoing genocide in Gaza has been used to justify the policing of communities, especially Muslim communities, communities that are perceived as Muslims, communities that are perceived as pro-Palestine or as pro-justice movements, human rights organizations, migrant-led organizations, organizations that work on migration. So this whole machinery of oppression, of using different kinds of styles and techniques, of course, including the use of how is it called again? Surveillance on this community. So what we are facing currently is just one of those moments where where it is a crisis of European identity. And of course, this is not the first time, and it's not going to be the last time, unless we actually address what the central issue is, and that is white supremacy and the structure of whiteness. And of course, you'd see in the recent elections in Europe, you'd see the rise of groups like the Rassemblement National in France, you see the rise of people like Meloni in Italy, of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. We also saw the EPP, which is the largest group in the European Parliament, for example, flirting with far-right ideologies as well, and we saw how they gained a lot of votes by also flirting with these far-right ideologies. So we see that in this moment of crisis, we see these different vehicles through which white supremacist ideas are almost liberalized or banalized, in a sense, borrowing your discourse. And you'd hear the liberals, and I like to, because I think it's important to distinguish here between liberals and leftists, and you hear a lot of liberals and centrists say, well, this is just a phase, this is uncommon in Europe, the right is probably going to rise, but soon enough, we are going to have, for example, we can see here in the UK with the Labour government, and people are like, now we have a Labour government, they are not as racist as the Tories, although I think that they are equally racist. They are just simply better at politicking, to be honest. And the question I think we need to ask ourselves is, why do we continuously have these phases, and why do we allow ourselves to be gaslit as these are phases, and with the right mobilization, we are going to push back on the right, and I think the discourse that we need to be having is, how do we address white supremacy in all of its different forms and in all of its different manifestations? And I think that this is where using intersectionality as a framework of analysis is really very important. How do we build alliances across different groups that are marginalized, whether this is the queer community, whether this is the Muslim or perceived as Muslim communities, whether this is the Roma community, the black community, whether as well this is the Jewish community, the climate justice community as well. How do we build broad alliances, grassroots broad alliances across different issue areas, and really confront head-on what the major issue is, which is white supremacy and the institution of whiteness? And of course, I'll be more than happy to get some questions from you or to engage in some kind of a discussion, because this is a collective effort that we need to engage in at INA. We are producing a paper on critical whiteness, which we will be releasing at the end of this year, which also really looks at this from the framework of white supremacy. We talk about anti-racism, but we also need to talk about whiteness as an institution. And aside of INA, outside of INA, I'm also writing a book chapter on the EU single market as a racial capitalist instrument of hierarchies. So this is information, I think, and resources that would share at some point in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emmanuel. Fascinating. Thank you. And thanks for taking the trouble to come here and join us today. So now we've heard from all the speakers. The floor is open to everyone now. So let's listen to our guests in the audience. Some of you are very experienced professionals, practitioners. You've been involved in anti-racism campaigns for many, many years. So I think if you have questions for the speakers, especially Liz and Sophia, about the report, but also to address some of the other points raised by the other speakers, please feel free to raise your hands. Natasha, over to you. And if you could just say a little bit about yourself and before you ask the question.
Yes, of course. My pleasure. So my name's Natasha. I'm one of the co-founders of Civil Society Consulting and therefore of Steps to Togetherness movement. And Steps to Togetherness is a kind of, well, first and foremost, it's a practical manual of 32 practical actions that we can all take as individuals or as community leaders to build connections within and between communities and therefore foster togetherness. So I love what you said, Emmanuel, and yeah, completely agree. How do we unite? I always think of Fred Hampton, the Black Panther, although that might sound a bit radical in some ways, but that's what he tried to do, to create a rainbow alliance and bring everyone together to bring down white supremacist culture, and I'd love to see that happen. But what do you think of the 32 Steps to Togetherness as a way of doing that, as a contributing force to try and do that from the bottom up?
Over to you.
Okay.
Please,
thank you. First of all, kind of like agreeing that, we need to kind of like, that's nice. I think that this is not necessarily a question that I can, as an individual, respond to, because I think that this is a question of our collective, approach to white supremacy. But to reflect, I think, on the 32 Steps of Togetherness, because I was in October, actually, when I was also there when it was launched. And I think that to combat the institution of white supremacy, we need all different kinds of ways of approaching it. I don't think that there is one particular way of combating white supremacy. We need to use all of the tools at our disposal. And of course, the manual, the framework, which is proposed by the 32 Steps to Togetherness, is also one of those frameworks that we can use, but it cannot be the only framework because we're also dealing with structural issues. And I think that why community healing, bless you,
Sorry.
and I think that why community healing and community togetherness is an important tool, we also need to be able to confront those. I like using the, is it an anecdote? I mean, I don't know how to refer to it, but to make an omelette, you need to break an egg. And so sometimes it's hard to communicate and to build community with groups that do not want to be a community with you. And this is where I think that sometimes approaches like the 32 Steps to Togetherness, why they are important, cannot be the only tool. Sometimes we also need to say that, well, you are simply a racist. And you really need to work on yourself. And no amount of healing sometimes does that. So I think that this is where we really need a balance of different approaches. Of course, 32 Steps to Togetherness is one of those, but we also need other kinds of approaches as well to kind of like, have this melange where we have a framework which addresses the different kind of facets and the different manifestations of white supremacy in all of its forms.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? One there, can I see? You go.
My name is Nassim, so I work for NVIDIA's Monitor among other things, so an analyst for politics. A question specific to Liz or anyone who can answer this really. I think today the total number of people charged over the protest about 62, maybe more, I'm not sure. What were they charged under anti-terror laws? I mean, I assume if Muslims were protesting that way, you'd probably be anti-terrorist. So some may look at that and say the system is working. 62 people were charged for rioting. And some would say, no, it's not working because it was Muslim. They will be charged under probably different sets of laws and not anti-terror laws. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And also, from a narrative perspective, does this also fuel the right-wing grievance narrative that, the two-tier system, these are white extremists who have been fast-tracked and prosecuted, whereas if it was Muslim or someone else, in their understanding, they probably would not have been prosecuted. So would that, in the long term, have a boomerang effect in the sense that it will impact on pro-Palestinian activists? There would be a pressure on the government to prosecute pro-Palestinian activists. So there is that to consider. So just those two angles. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I haven't got the latest figures with me. I should know things like that. But there's a lot more there's been a lot more convictions, I think. We're talking about the white rioters. There's been quite a lot. I would think it's probably in the hundreds of convictions so far. But don't quote me on that. I need to quickly look at our website and find that out. Help! The internet's down. So, but most of the prosecutions. I mean, we're looking into this. We're actually starting a little research project, actually about how the government. Look, we want to ask the question: is how did the government's interpretation of the riots as being based in violent thuggery play out in the courts? Because if you look at the kind of things that the government said, it would seem that the modus operandi for the riots was violent thuggery, not racist violence. It was like racist violence was a byproduct of attacking the police. But from our point of view, the whole purpose of the riots was to create a racist atmosphere and to go out and attack asylum seekers and mosques, etc. So most of the prosecutions so far have been for violent disorder. And that would have been the prosecutions against both the far right and Muslim communities who defended them, Muslims who defended the mosque, say, from attack. And also people who are just anti-fascists who might have got arrested as well, because I agree that we do have to make a distinction between liberal Islamophobia, and I call that sort of secular fundamentalism actually, which does also move into left-wing thought. But at the same time, when it comes to protecting the community, the anti-fascist movement does come from a left tradition and also from a trade union tradition, and those are our allies, and those are also people who may have been arrested. Most of the prosecutions are for violent disorder. They've moved towards prosecution for rioting, which is a more serious offence. In fact, the first prosecution, I believe, was against a 15-year-old for rioting. But what I'm seeing, and it's early days yet, so we have to see whether this percolates through. We need to look at the data, a lot more data. But what worried me was that the lack of a racially aggravated offence to the violent disorder, particularly actually when it came to the attacks on asylum hostels. So it was violent disorder against the police and property. And, you know, it really made me cross, if you want to know the truth, because we had all this rhetoric a few weeks ago about politicians feeling unsafe in their homes. But what do you think these asylum seekers felt in the hotels and the hostels? They were their homes. It might not have been a great home, but it was the only home that they had, and petrol bombs and things were being thrown at them. But from what I can see, that the racially aggravated aspect of the crimes hasn't been placed into the equation, largely. In some cases, yes, but largely. I think the other thing that I would see as problematic, and taking your point that you know, although we want justice for the victims of these crimes, harsh sentencing isn't the only thing, actually. We want education, right? I mean, there was a report in the Daily Mirror last week about teachers and what they are having to cope with when young children, even primary school children, go into the schools and say racist stuff. I mean, what are you meant to do with a 5 or a 6-year-old? Are we going to lock them up as well? You know, they're getting these views from somewhere, and we can't just see punishment as the solution. So I think what sort of strikes me as a little bit worrying with the prosecutions is that, you know, there's a double standard here. There are people receiving harsh sentences for online comments. And some of the online comments were incitement to racial hatred and should have been prosecuted. Some of them were people spreading disinformation. And you know what? You're thinking, well, you know, if a housewife from somewhere gets a few years for spreading disinformation, and Nigel Farage can sit in Parliament and do his dog whistle every 2 minutes, and to go around in his car filming, you know, going to asylum hostels around the country, and he never gets prosecuted. There's a double standard here. So, I mean, and the social media stuff does worry me, because, I mean, I was saying to my colleagues, what if we have a situation where somebody believes that somebody is being killed by the police in Hackney, and somebody puts out on social media reports coming in that black man killed by the police in Hackney, and it's just a rumour and it isn't true, and that person is then accused of spreading extremist disinformation and gets a heavy sentence. So yes, I do think we need to look in these things. And when it comes to the final part of your question, sorry I've gone on for a long time, about is it going to feed the white grievance narrative? Well, it's difficult. Well, yes, of course it will. But if people incited racial hatred, we have to deal with that. If they went and firebombed an asylum centre or came tooled up to attack a mosque, we have to deal with that. But the whole problem is, unless we go out into communities, unless we have our allies in the trade union movement, in the left, in the anti-fascist movement, who will embed themselves in these communities and start to win the arguments over, we're just going to be hemmed in all the time.
Thank you. Sophia, do you want to come in? Maybe also reflect on how the report has been received. Obviously, it was published before the elections. How has it been received? Have you had opposition?
I think on the whole, the report's been received really positively, and I think people are increasingly seeing the links between the far right and the mainstream, and that's becoming very much accepted, whereas before I think people weren't making those connections as much. And I think the relevance of the report has been completely shown with the events of the last month.
So did you have to revise it a bit more since the elections?
We haven't had to revise it, but we've been sort of like updating it and continuing on research. Like it sort of never stops. We always we're always recording, especially in our weekly calendar of racism and resistance, where we're recording across society what structural racism looks like at an electoral level, in terms of racial violence, in terms of social issues. So we're always sort of recording and then expanding our analysis.
Good. Since Amina needs to leave very shortly, if there's any questions for Dr. Amina, please feel free to ask. But maybe we'll take 2-3 questions at a time to save time. So, Sadia, just say a little bit about yourself, then your question.
Yeah, so I'm Sadia, I travel from Manchester today, where I also work with Mark and Natasha and also do some work around Palestine and Israel. I guess it was a couple of things really. I was just thinking about how the media didn't really report very much on the attacks as being anti-Muslim. It was mostly sort of like anti-immigration, but we know that actually the crux of it is anti-Muslim, and we know that. So that dehumanization of Muslims is for me linked to what you were saying, Emmanuel, earlier on about the dehumanization of Palestinians, and it came around about that kind of time, and it just kind of ties in. And then I guess there was a couple of other points. It's not necessarily questions, but I think also we think about Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hate in Europe is probably a bit more institutionalized, but I guess what we're seeing here is public attitude. So how do we respond to that in terms of people who are not only Muslim but others? And when we're talking about recommendations to the government, and they really need to speak to Muslims that other Muslims actually have a relationship with, because they want to speak to Muslims that they feel like are the right Muslims. So I think that there's some conversation that needs to be had with the government in particular around who they engage with, because as far as I'm concerned, I've worked in cohesion for a very long time after the 2001 riots in the northern towns, and the rhetoric has changed from being Asian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi, which with the community there, to Muslim. And that, I think, has been because of the policies from the government. So, although we're supposed to be working with the government to eradicate Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate, I feel like, actually, because we're not seen as important, actually because we don't even have a definition. So, kids who are coming into the school saying things, there's nothing for us to respond to them with, because there's nothing to support or protect us. So then, as Muslims, Muslims, everyday Muslims, this is not a question.
Okay.
Don't necessarily want to also reporting, because there's lack of reporting. So I guess there's lots of different issues that are kind of brought up, but generally I think, I don't feel like anything's getting any better, but because we're not, it's getting worse, this thing around we don't exist and we're dehumanized, so actually there's no Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hate doesn't exist, and that's where we're heading, and that's my fear.
Thank you, Sadia. So this part of the segment is really to ask questions and also share experiences. So it's okay to just elaborate. It's fine. So I'll take maybe a couple more questions before we ask the speakers to respond.
So the question really was around actually what do we need to do about this? So
I've got that done. Okay. Who had his hands raised? At the back, please.
Muhammad Hamdi from ATV London. So, question to Sophia, you said it was good reception for the report. Was there any mention to it on mainstream media, BBC, Sky, main newspapers in the land? And to the doctor, to the professor, to the lecturer, have you ever done any studies how to reach the people who voted for Nigel Farage, for example? Because we talk here, but then unless you reach them, or a portion of them, what will be the point of all the efforts that is being done? Is there anything written on that?
Okay.
Any idea?
Can I add to that question?
Very quickly.
To Amina as well. How do you tell liberals that they have anti-Muslim sentiments? I mean, for them, they're enlightened, they don't see themselves as being racist and progressive, rational people. So how do you do that?
Okay, thank you. So, a number of questions from Sadia regarding, talking to the Muslim, the good Muslim, bad Muslim. The government selects who they want to talk to.
selective.
Very selective. So I convened a press conference, as mentioned by Liz, a couple of weeks ago, Islamophobia Action Group, and we made 4 demands. One of them was to talk to the relevant Muslim organizations. Don't go through intermediaries or third parties. The Muslim Council of Britain is the largest by far in the UK and has a lot of work in the country. But the government fails to talk to the MCB directly. How can that be even right in this day and age? And then you want a solution for the Muslim community. So this is one of the demands. So how do we address that? Will the new Labour government understand and talk to Muslim communities direct? So that's one question. Then about the Palestinian dehumanization. So did you come in?
I just wanted to add to it, I guess, part of the complexity of your question, which I think is a great question, is how do you challenge and hold people accountable and educate, I guess, whilst trying to keep people generally on side, people that do want to learn and want to improve, and, you know, keep an air of collaboration as well.
Okay. And also the point that Nassim was about Nigel Farage, so if you could address those three. Quite a lot to unpack.
That's a lot to unpack, yeah.
Give the mic first, please.
Sorry. Yeah, so I've made some notes as well, but in terms of the reaching those potential swing voters, the new reform voters or AFD or Rassemblement National or whoever they might be across the continent, the other part of that project that I mentioned, we looked at the best practices. And I think it really echoes what we looked at sort of 2017 through to 2019 is somewhat echoed in the 32 Steps to Togetherness. It's actually really small steps that practitioners, and I think we surveyed over 200 practitioners across Europe. It's very small steps of whilst you have the normalisation of Islamophobia, there's also highlighting the normalcy of Muslims, that we're really quite everyday, we're quite boring, and highlighting those things and that public-facing stuff that Muslims do in the everyday that really can have some of the most profound and the biggest impacts, and whether that's through some of the women's groups we looked at and the ways in which women come together across faith lines to sort of facilitate community concerns. And I think that speaks to what some of Liz was talking about, how the far right mobilised this time round. But really Muslims doing, and in Brussels there's quite a lot of that, these sort of collections for the homeless, the hungry on the streets. It's really those normal actions that can have sometimes the biggest ripple effect and the biggest impact. That's what we found so far in our research. But I think there is a lot of what we do in which that we're preaching to the converted already. We're singing to the choir that already knows these songs. And I think collectively as kind of anti-racist activists there's a lot of thinking work we need to be introspecting and perhaps doing some of that. On the question of kind of liberal Islamophobes educating while kind of keeping an amicable and convivial atmosphere, if you like, and kind of speaking also to the question of the invisibilization of Islamophobia, I think that they're again interrelated. How do you call people out on Islamophobia? And I think in some ways calling people out across the political spectrum, whether that's the far right, the hard right, or those who see their Islamophobia as a necessary good on that kind of liberal end of the spectrum, it's really about having the tools to define what we're talking about. And we always come back to these discussions of semantics and definitions, but really we do need a definition. We need something, and whether that is Islamophobia and we recognise all the complexities that sit around it, or whether there's something else there, and there's lots of work going on in that regard. We need the tools to define, we need to be able to showcase how often and how it's happening, and I think that work's being done. It's just about pooling it together, not reinventing the wheel. And I think with liberal, I'm not sure I've got the answer just yet. When I was doing my PhD on Muslim women in politics, the amount of kind of the lay people that would come to me and they're like, but you know, you think you're emancipated and you think these Muslim women in politics are emancipated, but they don't really know, do they? They couldn't possibly understand. And I think part of it, I guess, as well, is breaking down some of those stereotypes, Islamophobic stereotypes, around that lack of agency of Muslims and voice around kind of questions of the MCB, and really showcasing some of those things to say, well, actually, you know, in the case of women who wear hijab, for example, as one of the examples I look at in my own work, really saying we have autonomy, we have a choice, but we can also see that whilst, for example, European bans on Muslim women's dress or regulation of Muslim women's dress or the criminalization through security narratives of Muslim men who have the beard, etc., whilst that, you know, they're framed in one particular way, it's about saying, well, that's also, that on the one hand is problematic in France, for example. It's equally problematic to be forcing anyone to dress in a certain way or forced wearing of hijab in places like Iran and Saudi. So it's about having that critical distance, if you like, in our narratives as well, and kind of being able to unpick and engage and not kind of resort to defensive approaches. But yeah, I'm not sure I have the definitive answer just yet. When I do, I'll let you know.
Can I
Yes,
try
sure.
to, I would thank you, Amina. I would also try to reflect on the question about liberalism, for example. How do you speak to liberal centrist voters that, you know, they also perpetuate or hold Islamophobic and racist views? This is really where our tool of, like, you know, addressing it as white supremacy is important, because a lot of the time we look at Islamophobia and of course the different forms of racism as interpersonal issues, you know, like people who are overtly saying these things or those things. But when we need to be able to explain it as a structure. Sometimes we do not necessarily intend to be Islamophobic or to be racist or to be that. But modern society as it is built on the institution of white supremacy. Our education, our religious institutions, our family institutions, our language, all of this is built on a structure of white supremacy. So yes, you could be a liberal voter, you could have Muslim friends or black and brown friends, as some of them say. I can be Islamophobic or I can be racist because I have black and brown friends. I have friends who go to the mosque, I break bread with them, I go to their houses for Ramadan. Yes, that may be all true, but unless we actually understand that these are institutions, and sometimes we do not necessarily want to be that way, but if we do not deconstruct our whiteness, we end up participating in this. And this is where books like Frantz Fanon's Black Faces, White Skins, Black Skins, White Faces really comes into play. It talks about how do we deconstruct racism and imperialism within ourselves before we do it within society. And so I think that is the message that we need to be able to share. Yes, you might not want to, but your privileges, all of this as a result of this institution of whiteness. And unless we tackle the institution of whiteness, even the whole project of democratically voting is also an institution of whiteness, which we need to be able to question. So I think this is how we try to approach it. Like we need to be able to tackle whiteness as a project.
Thank you. We've just got about maybe 3-4 minutes before the call to prayers. Just to let you know, the call to prayer will be for 2 minutes. Stay seated. We'll continue for another 5 minutes before we break for the actual prayers for 15 minutes, okay? And it's a bit complicated. Can I quickly go to Sophia and Liz to answer the question about some of the protests or violence that was portrayed as anti-immigration, anti-refugees, not Islamophobic? And also, how was the report picked up by the mainstream media? If you can maybe just address those two questions.
Yeah, I think that was a really important point, the way that the riots were framed as anti-immigration and as if these protesters had legitimate grievances. That was sort of said a lot in the media. And I think that was just a way of making, somehow saying that, it was invisibilizing the anti-Muslim racism, the Islamophobia, and just a way for the mainstream to not acknowledge the fact that these were racist. And I think it's really important that we need to highlight the connection between Islamophobia and anti-migrant racism, because obviously they're so interconnected in terms of who is perceived as Muslim and who's been targeted in these acts of violence. So I think it's more important than ever that we sort of build coalitions and sort of support each other widely in the community and make sure that everyone is protected. Because another thing that we noticed in the media was that at times the attacks on asylum housing, for instance, they weren't really covered as much as attacks on Muslims in the community, and that's also an issue. So I think it's really important that we highlight both. And the other thing I wanted to mention in relation to your question was the importance of context and connections. The fact that the Palestine marches have been going on a weekly basis, and that the demonization of Palestinians, the dehumanization of Palestinians is so intimately linked to what we're seeing here. And I think that's really important to make those connections, because again, what connects it is racism. And I think we need to be very sort of upfront about that and make sure that we have a wider context of how these riots erupted and when. And for me, I think it was a week before the riots.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
Continue for a couple of minutes if you want to.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that a couple of weeks before the riots, we saw like a horrific incident on social media of a Muslim family being attacked in Manchester Airport by the police. And for instance, all these different instances of Islamophobia, they sort of build up, but we don't necessarily make the connections between them or like draw attention to the wider systemic issue of the dehumanization of Muslims and migrants and asylum seekers. So I think it's important for us to always like widen the lens and not just get stuck into individual instances, but make the connection.
Of Palestine. Sorry, there's some interesting work that Jasmine Zine, I think, has recently published around the kind of interconnection of the situation in Palestine with Islamophobia, that anti-Palestinian sentiment functions through Islamophobia, and kind of not to separate those, to kind of continue to centre that bit. So yeah, Jasmine Zine's quite an interesting... Zine, yes, yeah, I'm sure she's written on that.
Great.
Sorry, the only reason I asked that question is I've recently found a lot of young Jewish people who are supporting reform and voting reform, and for all these reasons. So it's just trying to think about all the wider context, I guess, what you're saying.
Okay. Thank you. So we've got about 4 or 5 minutes before the actual prayers, so we'll take a couple more questions. But let me go to Mark first, if there's any reflections on some of the questions, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much. And really about the white supremacism, and also the question from the back about the white communities and how you reach those white communities. And I just want to take you 70 miles down the road, down the M11 to West Suffolk. I stood as a parliamentary candidate. I talked to 800, 900 people, 98% white people in this area, Newmarket, Hayfield. About half of them aged over 65. Most of the people not having any faith. Low unemployment. Unemployment wasn't an issue. In fact, there were many more jobs than there were people to do those jobs in those areas. But a lot of angst on the doorstep, and a lot of fear. And a lot of people were saying to me, Mark, we don't know what to think. We don't know what to do. We don't actually understand the world very much anymore. And I think, just to pick up some other points, the trade union movement has sadly declined. I'm talking about an area where the Labour Party hasn't really existed. There isn't a tradition of collective collaborative action. But a lot of people very isolated, very lonely, and very easy to manipulate. And there were 2 or 3 boxes of the ballot boxes when they come back on the night. And I was standing for the Green Party. I'll own up to that one. But I was with my Liberal Democrat colleagues and my Labour colleagues. 2 or 3 boxes came back from these villages near Lakenheath and Mildenhall, where a few thousand people lived, and everybody had voted reform. You look, you've got, there isn't a Labour vote, there was one Green vote. It was actually horrendous. And they were all motivated by a complete sense of panic. This is obviously before the riots. And not feeling that there was any social cohesion in their communities. But there wasn't any diversity. Coming back to that one, just tackling on that. 1/3 of households, they live on their own. And certainly talking to older white women, huge fears could be wrapped up. Really would. Because nobody was countering them. Nobody counters those sorts of things. So I think we've got something really happening in some of the communities that are old, demographically aging, with no faith, no trade union backgrounds, nothing really going on. And that with big screens shouting at them all the time.
What's the alternative?
Yeah. And people saying to me time to, oh, I think that Farage has got it right. And there's nobody out on the street campaigning to give them different perspectives. So that's all that they get. And they are very hateful. But when you talk to them in an individual sense, that hate doesn't really come across, but it's there. It's there, it's very easily articulated, and it's very frightening when you're out trying to encourage them to think in a slightly different way.
Thank you, Mark, for those reflections. I know we've had hands from Rabina Rahman. I'll come back to you after prayers because I don't want to rush you. Rabina is a victim of Islamophobia that she suffered recently, so she can talk about experience. But we'll break now for 15 minutes. We'll resume in 15 minutes. Thank you. If you follow Rabina, she'll show you. Men can play in games.